I've launched, I think it's 56 or 57 apps at this point, and all but about 6 of them have completely failed. I say that mostly because it's like I've launched more failures probably than anyone in the App Store in some ways, and that's the way that you can end up with success. I've just kept trying, and it got me that little baseline of income that it was like, okay, I'm not just wasting my time here.
Hey, you're listening to the Sub Club Podcast, a show dedicated to the best practices for building and growing subscription app businesses. We'll share insider secrets from the top subscription apps on the app stores. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Sub Club Podcast. I'm your host, David Bernard, and with me, as always, Jacob Eiding. Hello, Jacob.
Hi, David number one. How are you?
I'm good. Our guest today, David number two, is David Smith, longtime indie developer and podcaster. Starting with audiobooks in 2009, David has built many successful apps over the years, including Widgetsmith, Pedometer++, and Sleep++. His most recent app, Widgetsmith, went viral on TikTok and hit #1 on the App Store. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to chat. We've chatted in person a few times and bumped into each other at WWDC over the years. You've been doing this pretty much since the very beginning, right? When your audiobooks came out in 2009, when did you actually start working on that?
It wasn't even my first app. I think my first app that never went anywhere was launched in 2008. So, I was within a couple of months of the App Store launching. So I've been doing it essentially as long as you could. And I think I started working on audiobooks the end of 2008. And it's just kind of grown from there. So it's about 13 years in the App Store.
Wow. Yeah, about like me and Jacob, actually. We both had apps on the App Store.
Halcyon days of paid up front and only 200 apps on the App Store and all that stuff. It was a good time. Were you a Mac developer before that, or how did you trip into iOS?
Sure. So, I was a web developer before I did this. And so, honestly, I started writing apps before I even actually owned an iPhone. It seemed like a good opportunity, and I wasn't particularly happy where I was at work. And it was just something that I thought would be an interesting opportunity. And I started learning and didn't know what I was doing for a long time, but just kept at it. And so it's just one of those things that I got into mostly because it seemed like a good opportunity at the time. And so, I initially was doing some web consulting as well as my iOS work, and eventually the web consulting disappeared and it became iOS full time. And that's, sort of been the story for more than about 10 years now, probably.
Yeah, no, I was kind of similar. Like I just saw it come in and was like, maybe I should. And I went and picked up the Mac OS, the Hilligus book, and learned Mac OS programming. Because there was no iOS book, right? There was no iOS. It was iPhone OS, right? But yeah, it was a different time, fewer apps, way smaller community. So yeah, interesting decade.
Well, hey, I did want to start by digging into the story of audiobooks, and I think one of the interesting things to me, because it happened to me as well, is how having this kind of foundation app that started in 2009 that did well enough. And I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but I think if I know your story correctly, that's audiobooks is kind of what helped you make the leap to be full-time indie. And then once you become full-time indie, you started to have the time to experiment with all these other apps. And a similar thing with me, like I've had a couple of key apps over the years that kind of provided that like foundation of income that let me keep going. And then that allowed me to experiment with all these different apps, like Launchcenter Pro ended up coming out of already having income to be able to take this big bet. And then Mirror came along where it was doing really well and I was able to take other bets. And so it seems like that's somewhat the story of audiobooks. So let's dig into that. So it was 2008, you had a failure, and then you start working on this audiobooks in late 2008. What was the inspiration and how did you kick off that?
Yeah, so audiobooks was an app that it wraps. It's a wrapper and a player for free public domain audiobooks. That's all it was, and it was essentially just coming into the market because at the time, there wasn't an easy way to listen to any audiobooks on the iPhone at that point. There wasn't an Audible app. There wasn't, Apple didn't have anything, and it was just you could listen to audiobooks, I think, in the music app potentially, but it was kind of strange.
You could buy them on iTunes, right? And
Yeah,
they were
it
like
was-
20 bucks a pop.
Yeah.
And so that's where the idea for the app came from, and it's just sort of it took off in a way that I wasn't really expecting, and necessarily that it became, and it was successful. And because it was an app that had a very broad appeal, it was something that I think, like you say, so like built a platform for me to then continue to experiment and try things. And I mean, that app has gone through, originally it was paid up front, and then it went free with ads. And then I tried selling my own ads for a while. I sort of went through lots of different models over the years, but it was certainly the app that I think was my first thing that was commercially viable, where I don't think on its income initially I would have been able to go indie, but it was the kind of thing where it became a client for me when I was doing consulting work. And I would say, like, it would buy my time because it would start to generate enough income. And at first it was like, maybe it would buy me 10 hours a week that I could work on my kind of like independent stuff. And then maybe the event would do better. And now it could buy 20 hours a week of my time. And eventually bought all of my time. And I think that model worked really well for me to have that initial success that I could then keep trying things. And I mean, I've launched, I think it's 56 or 57 apps at this point. And all but about 6 of them have completely failed.
That's incredible.
And I say that mostly because it's like, it's like I've launched more failures probably than anyone in the App Store in some ways. And that, like, that's the way that you can end up with success, though, is that it's just like I've just kept trying. And I think audiobooks was a useful one because it got me that a little baseline of income that it was like, okay, this is not just, I'm not just wasting my time here. But it allowed me to then just keep trying, and lots of things, lots of ideas, and lots of things went different places. Some of them had their moment in the sun and then like failed off. Like there was a period in the App Store where the classic model is you had a paid upfront app and you'd make, a reasonable amount of money in the first 2 weeks, and then it would make almost no money ever again. And that was just the way it was. And like, that's a model that isn't very sustainable, but it's like if you had something that had a bit more, regular income as a baseline, you could make work.
And that's how you incentivize a developer to make 60 some apps, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I just as like a curiosity, did the audiobooks in audiobooks, what was the source for those? Were those like pre-recorded public domain or? Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a thing called the LibriVox project where people volunteer to read classic audiobooks. So essentially, Dickens or Jane Austen or things like this that are out of copyright. And so people volunteer to read them, and then those are just available on the internet. And this essentially, my app was just a wrapper for that. It was just a way to get into that. And the people who run the LibriVox project were actually very happy with it. Like because for them, there was no easy way to get their audio onto an iPhone. And so they were delighted that this app was just creating a venue for their project to get a lot more visibility and interest.
And you got an incredible like App Store parked name, just audiobooks. That's a great one.
That's exactly what I was going to dive into. Like, how was that just kind of a happy accident, or in 2008 did you already start to notice? Because it took me like 3 or 4 years. I'm a little slow in the uptake to realize that these like naming a keyword instead of trying to create a brand was actually a fairly successful strategy for a lot of apps. So did you just stumble into that, or was it somewhat intentional?
I mean, I think it was largely just a result of I didn't have a better name, and because the content of it was so generic, it wasn't like there was a natural branding that I was doing this. And it's like, it's the early days of the App Store. So you could just pick a proper noun and it would be available because there were only a few hundred or a few thousand apps in the App Store. And so I picked it, I tried it, and it certainly has turned out well in that regard, that it still has reasonably good, search optimization and things. Because if you want an audiobook and you go into the App Store and search audiobooks, it's an exact name match. So, Audible likely still ranks higher because it has more traffic, but it's going to be in one of the top couple of hits. And that's just a natural thing. And I wouldn't say it was intentional, like this is part of some grand plan, but it is certainly something that I found useful. I mean, many of my other apps, like I have an app called Pedometer Plus Plus and Sleep Plus Plus, which the plus plus, when the App Store is doing its algorithm for searching, typically just sort of drops off. And so they rank very well for those terms for sleep or pedometer. I learned though that it's important to have something be somewhat trademarkable just for legal reasons and copycats and those kind of things. And so having something additional to it was helpful, that I could trademark those terms and go after people who are are being, sort of trying to benefit from any sort of success I've had on it. But I think, and those tricks, they're always a bit tricky because like they are useful at the time, but they're not really long lived, and you can't rely on them. Like if Apple just tweaks their algorithm slightly, then it goes away. So it's not worth chasing necessarily, but it certainly, in this case, worked out well for me and was useful, but is, less of a factor now.
If you made audiobooks today, it would be audiobooks $, tiny cross, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to ask though about, algorithm changes over the years and things like that. Have you seen because you took it free in like 2010 or something, right? Like pretty early, you switched to the in-app purchase model. So like what I saw with my Mirror app was that once I switched it it was like Mirror by AppCubby or something. And I switched it to Mirror with like a little Unicode symbol that looks like a mirror. And so then it was the exact match for Mirror. And then it just really took off. And it's been the number one. And I ended up selling that app in 2017, but it's still the number one hit for Mirror on the App Store. And I got to, I think around 2015, there was kind of a peak of like 6,000 organic downloads every single day. And then even though like the ASO didn't change, like it still ranked for all of these keywords and everything else, it did slowly kind of start to dip. And I kind of wonder if that somewhat follows the kind of people going to the App Store searching generic keywords. It was like the iPhone, more and more people were buying them, more and more people were coming like first time into the app. So you can either confirm or debunk my thesis here that there was kind of a wave and then a crest and a fall of these organic searches on the App Store.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, I couldn't speak with authority about it, but that seems consistent with my experience, where I think there in the early days of the App Store, there was definitely a higher sense of just curiosity that people would open the App Store and just be browsing and just not necessarily looking for anything in particular because they didn't know what their phone could do. They hadn't they have a phone and they knew it was going to be good for, texting and email, but, oh, there's an App Store, let's see what it does. And I think that phase is certainly behind us, that I think people know what they want to use their phone for. And very often they're going for a particular thing, not just like browsing. And I think if you were, and similarly, I imagine if you're just looking for a generic term, you may not start in the App Store, even if that's where you're going to get the app. You may start in
Google,
in Google or YouTube or somewhere else. That
app.
Yeah, like you're that's because there's a mature enough ecosystem there that there's a better way to find that. And even though the App Store is a great place, but it's I think that those kind of just generic organic downloads are much harder to find at this point. And I think that's just the reality.
And did you see that similar kind of build and crest and fall as far as like, since audiobooks is so heavily reliant on organic installs, from what I understand, you don't do any paid advertising for it. Did it kind of crest around that 2014, 2015 and then, or have organic downloads been pretty stable?
Yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't tell you a date. I have to look at the numbers, but it certainly isn't that way. That there was that. I think there have been a couple of phases of the App Store, and there was in the early first maybe 4 or 5 years, you had that much sort of just higher interest, and it was easier to be seen. And I would say, sort of in the last 5 years, the user acquisition reality of being in the App Store is very different. That it is, there's a lot more, either like just organic is more challenging, and I don't do very much paid, but I think if that would be the only way that if I actually wanted to affect change to my downloads beyond kind of just word of mouth and natural sort of, I think at this point a lot of my downloads are coming from sort of the word of mouth version of organic rather than someone coming to the App Store with a need and then trying to find it. And so that's just a guess, but I think there certainly is those. The App Store has changed dramatically in 13 years. I think there's certainly no doubt about it.
I think the user base too. I mean, I think about the way that I was sure what we were talking about is I was thinking about like my usage patterns pre and kind of post that era. And I think one thing that has changed is I kind of found all the apps I needed by 2015. Yeah. I got my podcast app, I got my this app, I got my that app. I don't really go in there just doing that what you're talking about, the like, oh, what can I find for my phone anymore, right? It's just not something I do. I still occasionally get a recommendation or I find something organically or whatever. But and yeah, like in 2021, this is very few people's first smartphone, right? This is like somebody's fifth iPhone or plus, and so it's just like there's less curiosity, I think. But I guess that's exactly what we're arguing here.
So you mentioned you've probably failed more than any developer ever on the App Store, which is really cool. I mean, I in some ways feel the same way. I mean, I'm not nearly as prolific as you, but I mean, I've had, gosh, like 26 apps, and maybe 4 or 5 have been, reasonably successful. But so I'm going to put you on the spot here. Are there any things that really stick out of like, and like I can think of one app because I'm still working in the space, your weather app, but are there any apps that you can point to and say, I learned a very specific lesson from this app in those failures? Because I think a lot of people who've only ever had one app and that one app was super successful, there's kind of a confirmation bias. Like, I'm awesome, I did everything right, but it's like they don't even know what they don't know. They don't know what they did wrong. They just happen to like hit some level of product market fit. So any specific apps and lessons you learned from these failures?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like failure is obviously a complicated thing because I think I learned something from all of them, and so in some ways they were useful. But I think from a financial perspective is mostly what I'm talking about when they're sort of a failure on that. And I think the two areas that the biggest mistakes that I've learned is one is trying to really understand and having an honest evaluation of the size of the market you're addressing. And some of the things that I've launched are very focused, we're very niche, and that kind of a thing, it is possible to make it work, but the economics are incredibly difficult, and you're dealing with a very uphill battle if you're dealing with something that is only ever going to be useful to 10,000 people. Then great, that for the 10,000 people it might be really cool, but it's very unlikely you're going to make a sustainable living on an app that unless your economics can be so high that each one of those people is giving you a substantial amount of money on an ongoing basis. And I think some of my failures were things where I was like, ooh, this is really cool, and it's an app that does this, that something very specific, and it doesn't really end up working out. And I think the other thing that I found too is just having that sense of that apps, understanding what are the ongoing costs related to an app going to be, and making sure that the economics of that can balance out. And so in your example of my weather app, ultimately, like the app was successful. It had a reasonably good user base, but it existed in a time before subscriptions were a thing. Like they just didn't exist in the App Store. And so the economics of trying to make it so that people could continuously pay for the weather data that I had to buy for it just wasn't there. And at a certain point, it's like a change from being a business to a charity, because I was spending more money on the back end than I was, getting people on an ongoing basis. And that was something that I don't think it's easy when I'm building something to just ignore that, because the costs, especially early on, are so low. When you look at these things, and especially with most, if you're some kind of data service or some kind of hosting provider or something, you often will have a free tier or something that like and if in some ways success can be your own failing, because you haven't taken into account that, if this, if I get any amount of volume, then suddenly I'm going to be spending thousands of dollars a month supporting this app. And if the economics aren't balanced for that, then you have to, essentially shut it down and deal with that. And I think those are two things for that. It's usually when an app has failed, it's because either I didn't fully understand what the ongoing costs were going to be, or I didn't I wasn't realistic about how big of a market it is.
The unit economics are tricky because at the beginning it's hard to get good data because everything's so small. It's like, I can't really tell. I don't really know what my CAC is or what my cost of service COGS are. So you're just like, whatever. And then by the time it matters, it's too late, right? In some cases.
And I will say too, that you just used several terms that I have no idea what they mean. And I think this is another failing on my part, that like, my CAC and my cost of service cost, like, I don't know. This is fun, which is fine. I think, but that's
educational moment. Yes. Cost of user acquisition and what's COGS, cost of goods sold. Sorry, yeah.
There you go.
Those were things I didn't learn until I had a SaaS company, though. To be honest, right? Like it's interesting. Like the different, which I mean, just highlights kind of the world we're in now, right? Which is where most app developers are running a SaaS business, right? And which you were with the weather app. You just didn't kind of think about it in those terms. It was like an app with an API, but really it was a SaaS business. And That's why we're here at subclub.com to educate people. Actually, it's not .com, .co or whatever.
Yeah. Well, but I think there was definitely that teachable moment in that, insofar as that's another aspect of that failing is I think it's so easy coming at it from an engineering background that I can get too excited about the engineering aspects of what I'm doing, that I think that, there's this cool new API, there's this fun new feature, there's this cool problem I'm solving, and I can go down, spend a month of my time building this app, and then in the end, I haven't really thought about the marketing side or the economic realities or all of those things. And in some ways, it's like, that's fine, because part of what I'm good at is the engineering. And
right.
If anything, I've been able to just engineer my way out of this problem by I can just keep building. And eventually I've had enough things that just kind of naturally hit. And it isn't necessarily the most efficient way to do it or a way I'd recommend it. But I think that is an aspect of my failing where it is, and it's also the reality of being an independent developer, where like I don't have a staff, I don't have anyone else in that regard, and so it's not like I have a business, a business team or someone doing user acquisition or any of those things. Which, on the one hand, is great because it means my costs are really low. That my revenue is divided by 1, and I get to and I keep it. So if I was a team of 5 people and I'm dividing my revenue by 5, it's quite a hard thing to have 5x the revenue, and so it's like a trade-off that in some ways it'd be great if I could have both, but I'm not sure if it's actually reasonable or practical to.
I mean, really though, it's a good algorithm for finding, new APIs are the App Store version of the market shifting, right? It's when something gets created, right? There's a new opportunity. So exploring those and understanding those and finding out how you can remix those with existing ideas, as a team of 1, where 1 is an engineer, that's kind of your strategic advantage, right? It might not be ASO, it might not be acquisition, all these other things. It might be like, hey, what can I do cool stuff with computers? And I think historically that's been a pretty good ROI for a lot of companies. So I wouldn't necessarily call that a weakness, even though it's both, right? But
yeah, and that specifically has been part of your strategy, right? So like Widgetsmith, which we'll get to in a little bit, but even Watch Plus Plus, Pedometer Plus Plus, or WatchSmith, sorry. Yeah, tell us about your thinking around using these new APIs to get attention, to doing something that's never been done before as marketing, which is a great way to do it.
Yeah, well, and I think this is certainly something I've done time and time again, that like Pedometer Plus Plus, which is after Widgetsmith, the most successful thing I ever made, was the first pedometer app in the App Store. And it was, when the iPhone 5S launched, Apple introduced a step counting chip into it. And it was the first app that took care of it. And it's like for a few weeks, even, it was the only one. And it was one of my strategic advantages is the fact that I'm just one guy who really likes to program and is pretty good at doing things quickly. And that means that I can be there on day one. And I think that's beneficial in sort of 2 main ways. That being on there early is something that often gets Apple's attention, and it's ebbed and flowed in terms of whether that's important for Apple featuring you or not, but it's never a bad thing for Apple to feature you or to get on their radar. And, as an independent developer, that's one of the few things that I have that I can kind of pull on that Apple gets excited about, where on day one, here's this app that takes care of this new thing that they're trying to sell their new phone with, or whatever
that speed, even like a 1-person team compared to like a 3 or 5-person team, there's a real advantage. If it's just 1 person, like no communication overhead, no nothing, like you can just do it all in your brain, and like it's really hard to beat. I mean, I'm saying this as having watched our company grow so much. It's like, wow, the just like getting all these folks coordinated at the same time really is a different world than when it's just yourself like trying to put things together quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's just such the other aspect of this, just so much. It's so often I can do something faster than anyone else, not necessarily because there's something magic about me, but it's just I don't have it. There's no. It's not like it does that. Oh, there's a designer who will do a bunch of specs, and then that's going into we'll have a sprint planning meeting, and we'll break up the features, and it's this whole thing that like that's not my process. I just open up Xcode and start working, and so it's it means that I'm it's like, and I end up with, as long as I have a good idea in my mind, I can just be driving towards it. I don't need to go through a lot of infrastructure to get that. Like I don't have a roadmap with tasks with, sort of issues that I'm working through and burning down my, like, whatever, all those software things that you need to do if you have a big team and are valuable, but I just don't exist for me. And so there's that extra multiplier. And I think being there early is just, it gets attention and it creates opportunity that there's a vacuum. It's a short-lived thing. If I'd launched Widgetsmith a few weeks later, I don't think it would have mattered. It would have been complete, like, it is this very ephemeral, like, thing. Once a year, there's this giant opportunity for me, and I've sort of dove in and taken advantage of it several times. And sometimes it's worked, and sometimes it hasn't. Like my iMessage App Store apps didn't go anywhere, but that turned out that was a market that didn't exist. But I spent my summer making sure that I was there. And if they had been really important and was super cool, and Apple cared about it a lot, then I would have been there. And you never know that ahead of time, unfortunately. But that's, I think, just something that a small team can benefit dramatically from, is like taking advantage of that and being okay with, too, of not shipping things that are as robust and complicated as, fair enough, if I was a 5-person team, it could do more or have more capabilities, or be localized into more languages, or also launch on Android, or whatever those things that you would imagine would be beneficial. I don't have those, but like, it's just a trade-off for me.
Yeah. When the App Store is your marketing channel primary, right? It makes a lot of sense. We did this when I was at Elevate. This was a constant strategy for us, was what is Apple interested in? Even for us, we were a team of 10 or 20 at that stage, but like adding APIs, oh yeah, sure, it kind of makes sense. Okay, yeah, we can add that. Like, it's not on our product roadmap, not really something, but like, yeah, the benefits were tangible. But as you kind of mentioned, it has gotten, at some point, I think for a team of that size, the benefits of being in the, like, what's new. I forget what they used to always have a feature like what's new in iOS, whatever. Yeah. And you would get in that, and it would be a pretty good feature, but that has gone down over time. So now it's like, it's exclusively to the benefit of really small developer teams, right? That they can take advantage of that.
Yeah, well, and it's just, I think the impact of being because to your earlier point about, I think fewer people are searching for apps, and so being in a featured list in the App Store is not the thing that it used to be. That I remember the first time I got featured in the App Store, and it was crazy. Like, just it was completely mind bending.
Lasted a week
from
or more.
Yeah,
right?
It lasted a week, and I went from maybe I was having like in the tens of downloads a day to suddenly I'm having like tens of thousands of downloads a day, and it was just like. Yeah. Like completely mind bending, but that's not the reality anymore. Like that multiplier isn't there in the same way. Like, it's lovely to be featured, but it also is very muted now because it's not for a week. It's kind of on this random algorithmically driven basis where if you're the app of the day, you're actually the app of the day only for one person necessarily. Like, it's not like everyone in the world got it that day. And so those things lessen the impact of it, and their benefit becomes more in aggregate rather than kind of in an acute way.
One of the things you mentioned kind of in passing there was not having to wait on a designer. And that's something I actually wanted to talk about. As much as it's like the Apple ethos to be pixel perfect and to like have these like amazing, leather stitched icons back in the day, sure, or whatever. I regret spending as much as I did and kind of letting design in some ways overly drive the process. Because as an independent developer, where every penny I spend is money that's not going into my pocket, I spent tens of thousands, probably well over $100,000 on design over the last 13 years. And from what I understand, you've spent very little. So yeah. I mean, it sounds like that's intentionally part of your strategy. It's like you were saying, you're not a team of 5, so you keep your expenses down. But 2, you're also not waiting on them. So it was have you spent much on design over the years, or have you done it all yourself? And then has that been a very intentional for speed and cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've certainly tried spending money on design over the 13 years. Like, it's not that I've never done it, but it never paid off for me enough that for it to be something I continued doing. And I don't think I've done it in 5-6 years now. And at this point, the only design that I typically will ever pay for is app icon design, because that's just something that I can't do very well myself. Though even like Widgetsmith, the icon I made myself because it's just a blue round rect. Like I could handle that. And
it's like, a good icon.
Yeah, but it's fine. Like
And
it's
number
I
5 in
think
productivity, not doing so
yeah,
bad. I think you're a
like
pretty good icon designer, actually.
Yeah.
and I think, but it's to the point of like I think it's easy enough to like if you try to learn basic design and get competent at the basics, you can go that can take you a very long way. And I think really elegant, new, fancy design that's doing really like groundbreaking or cool things with fancy animations and all that stuff. Like I love it when I am using an app that does that. But that kind of design like that takes a tremendous toll on your development process. And I think
Mm,
a and like if you're a thoughtful developer who is willing to put in the work to just kind of like study what the basics of design are, you can get good enough that you can do a lot of it yourself. And I think that's something that has worked really well for me. And I think it's also been to my benefit that it isn't necessarily that I'm not waiting on a designer. It is that I'm a better developer because I understand. I took the time to study what makes a good design for an app, and so that informs my development, and then it allows me to build things that will be that are structured such that the
right.
design will naturally flow from it. And those types of differences that if I just was being handed a list, like here's a handful of mockups, go and build it, and I don't really understand why things are structured the way they are, then I'd often find myself in I'd pay myself into technical corners that if you are responsible for both the design and the development, the two are
Smooth,
blending
yeah.
together really well. And so I think it's something that I certainly recommend. And I think some of the best apps I think have come out of the one developer, one designer teams. Like I think that can be a useful model, but for me, it's just something that I think, in the same way that often I've known many designers who learn just enough coding to be able to sort of to make the basics. Like the same thing can go the other way. That a developer who puts in a little bit of time and is a student of what, like if you're using something and you start paying attention to why is this good, and you don't try and overreach and
Yeah.
like try and do things that are beyond your capability. Like I can make a really nice, clean UI. I can't make something that is clever and fancy, and that's fine. And I just if I scale my applications to fit what I can do, then I'm fine.
Yeah, I'll share in that. Like we're RevenueCat, we didn't have we have a full-time product designer now that helps with like dashboard work and stuff like that. But we didn't have. I was the only person doing design for the first 2 years, and very similar. Like I knew going into it, it was my weak spot. So I spent a few weeks one summer just like I took a like online color theory class, and then I just
Yeah.
like did some like basic tutorials, got really good at Sketch, and like made some mock-ups. And I had worked with a lot of great designers and kind of knew what the process was like. But yeah, again, it's like, what's your advantage? And in your case, it's the APIs and being first to market and all that stuff. And so you're not likely to get a lot of like, leverage or whatever out of having really great design. You just need it to be functional. You need it to be good enough. Something that's not going to turn people off, right? when they see the app and that's kind of the bar. And yeah, I agree with you. I think it's actually pretty easy to achieve at a with a minimal investment.
Yeah, and I think you also it's I very much like a model where the initial upfront costs are as low as possible. And if I need to double down on something and
Right.
like it becomes a situation where, oh, now I need design resources or I need something more graphically oriented or like things arise, like I'm delighted to spend money on an app that's making
Later.
money.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
rather than spending the money on something before it's even proven itself to
Yeah,
have
we've
any
spent a
legs.
lot on design since like
Now.
RevenueCats hit like our stride, but in the early days it was like, nah, like there's APIs. Like the design of the JSON is more important than the website.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it does force this kind of function over form approach. And I think that's where your apps have really succeeded is that you focus on them doing things well, like it's serving a specific purpose and serving that specific purpose very effectively. And that's where I think a lot of the kind of form over function design, even within Apple, I think Apple still makes this mistake a lot of focusing too much on how things are going to look and how things are going to come across versus like, well, how is it actually going to be used by people? And that's where I think I've fallen down a lot as well. Is like spending so much time on these pretty graphics, and then everything, then like the you can't like iterate quickly on a user interface based on feedback when it's all so polished and
Mm.
pixel perfect. Like it's so much harder to do iterative design to enhance the usability of an app when there's so many barriers and then so much already kind of like set in stone because it was designed this way, and you can't step back out of that as easily. So yeah, I think it's great the way you've done that.
The one thing that resonated with me, you said, David, was just how a designer, if they don't fully, and I love designers, all my designer friends are gonna hate me for talking bad about designers, but I think one universal experience of a developer is when you get handed something that is it looks great and like functional on paper, but like there's just like because there isn't like internal knowledge of UI kit, right?
Yeah.
And just like this thing that looks like, yeah, I know it's just pixels and it should be really simple, but like it's actually going to add hours and days to my and you know, if you're not an assertive developer that's going to be like, no, I'm just not going to do, well, you can do that on your business, right? But like because you own it, but if it, you know, if you work on a team or whatever, sometimes there's a lot of loss there where a developer will feel, and also like feel like it's a challenge, right? Like, oh yeah, I
Yeah.
can do that, right? And they end up over investing in these ornate user experiences or user interface elements. Um, it just like you talk about like ROI and whatever, like just not there, you know. So I think it's a very like prudent approach.
Yeah, for sure.
So I did want to touch on real quick, and I want to get to Widgetsmith and talk more about that. But I wanted to touch on your iOS version stats. So it's something I've really appreciated over the years. There's Flurry has published stats here and there, but your site has been like my go-to place to say, how's iOS 14 adoption going? So you publish publicly the version stats of your audiobooks app, which is a fairly broad market app. It's not perfectly representative, probably, of the entire market. But yeah, tell me about why you publish that, and then do you actually run a custom analytics stack to power that, or do you have a third-party analytics provider that you just pull the stats in from?
Yeah. So, I mean, that came from, I think there were certainly, I mean, I'm running it for years and years because in the early days of the App Store, there just wasn't good data on this kind of thing. And it was so, I remember finding that it was just so frustrating where I couldn't get a basic sense of like the different device distributions and iOS adoption rates and things. And so I just wrote something myself to do this, and I sort of shared it because it was really helpful. I thought it's like if it's helpful for me, it's going to be helpful for someone else. And audiobooks was the best app I had to make the public version of this for because it was my broadest kind of user base. That it wasn't as like Pedometer is great, but it's dealing with people who are fitness oriented, and so like some of my adoption numbers are like there's a skew to it, and it's a bit less mass market, but it's all built in custom. I've used analytics packages and things before, but especially with Apple being, it's a sort of like the privacy consciousness and things, it became something that I just didn't want to have. I want to have the minimum amount of third party code in my apps as I could, and something like the kind of analytics I'm collecting is very easy to do as just a little sort of custom thing that I wrote. That's just, it's just a little website that's collecting some very basic stats and being thoughtful about making sure that it doesn't log essentially anything except for very anonymized, aggregated things. Just so I don't collect any user level information whatsoever. It's all just being collected at an aggregate level. And it's just something that I wrote, and it's a basic thing, and I think it's a useful tool because this is sort of to the same thing of a question about velocity. It's like you can't know when you can drop old devices or which device to optimize for unless you actually collect that data and you actually look at it. And so like right now, for example, something that I always try and optimize my apps for the iPhone XR. Because in all of my apps, it is by far that screen size. So that it's the iPhone XR or the iPhone 11. Those are by far the most popular phones in the world right now. And so like that's my primary testing device. That's where I start. But I wouldn't know that if I wasn't collecting that kind of data. And I wouldn't have guessed that necessarily. And especially because I live in the like Apple tech ecosystem, and I would, in my mind, oh, it's probably just like the pro size, like the 11 Pro is probably the most popular phone because that's what all my friends have. But that's actually not the case. That's, that is a popular phone, but it's by any means the most popular. And so having that kind of data to back up my choices and making sure that, it's like I if I'm doing a design, I'll optimize it for that and then adjust it for the other ones rather than going the other way around. Or if I'm doing screenshots for the App Store, I make sure that my screenshots are perfect for that one. And even if sometimes I'll do, for the more minor phones, I might just say like use the, scale down the assets for something else. But that's a size that I will for sure use. And I think also it speaks to I think there's still some of this, but maybe a bit less. But in the earlier 8 days of the App Store, I felt like there was a group of people who were we felt like we were in this together. And like especially among kind of indie small developers, we tend to try and like help each other out. And so like I made that public. It was an internal dashboard, and then I just let me just publish this to a different URL because if it's to kind of just help out. And I think that was a nice thing that I think there are fewer indies than there used to be. But it's certainly an aspect of the community that I think is still nice when there are some aspects of it that still exist.
It's also really nice to have usually I would caution people to roll against rolling their own, right? But I think there is this like somewhat unserved niche of some of these tools get really expensive, even like an Amplitude or a Mixpanel or whatever. The pricing often is more favorable towards B2B and like smaller headcount or smaller like user base size apps. And you can lose this like kind of information. I gather it's not in App Store Connect, or it's probably crappy if it is.
It's like some of it's in there, but not really in a way that like App Store Connect sometimes has some of this stuff, but I like just having it myself. And there's also, it means that I can do additional beyond just demographic collection. There are a few things that I will do in here where, I can add in a hook and say, does anybody ever open this page of the app? And I can do a little basic, like those kind of basic analytics things that you can't do in App Store Connect. And so I can put this into my system and do those kind of basic collections, which a more sophisticated analytics package is just like, that's just a basic feature of it. But it gives you that kind of middle ground. And it's a tricky reality of, Apple wants, I have to put in my privacy things, all the things that I do. And so if I start using a third party thing, I have to be completely on board with everything they're using my data for. And so sometimes it's easier to just roll it, have it be basic and simple. I mean, these apps are not complicated. Or I think the initial version of this was actually, I just based it on the error log of a Nginx server where I just ran it.
Right, I was just going to ask, it looked a lot like headers or something. Yeah.
They would just make the request, and they would actually just all 404, like the analytics request was just 404. And I would just parse the error log and add it to a SQL file. And it's like, that was super straightforward and easy to build, and it's just a script.
You invented half of Mixpanel, basically.
And like that's what I think mostly just to say is it doesn't have to be hard, like super sophisticated and fancy. This is a backend utility tool, so you can very easily you could go crazy making it fancy, or you can just write a little script to process a log file, and you get just as much data out of it.
Yeah, that's great. I did want to touch on Widgetsmith. You've talked about it at length. So there's a great episode with you and Marco. I think what came out like 2 weeks after Widgetsmith hit #1, and so that's a really fun episode. People can kind of go get the history, but it's a cool kind of culmination of this story of launching 56 different apps, trying all these different things. And then you go after these brand new features with the widgets in iOS 14, and somebody picks the app up on TikTok. It goes viral. It hits #1 in the App Store. Just such a cool story as an indie developer to hit #1. And again, you've told a lot of that story other places, so I don't want to just rehash the whole story. But there were a couple of things that I wanted to go over, and I don't know if you've talked about it since. So one of the things that I think would be interesting to follow up on is just how the durability has been. So like you hit #1, it stayed there for like weeks, right? Or almost
it was about 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the market.
Yeah. So how has that gone since? And like you're still like #5. You're in the top 10 of productivity regularly. Has the app been durable download wise and revenue wise? Like how has it gone after hitting number one? Like,
I mean, I think it is. It certainly continues to be my most successful app, and I think it seems like it will be for quite some time. And obviously, the first couple of weeks were insane and completely like mind bending. And I think I exceeded my like to date App Store downloads. Of all my apps over the last 13 years were in a few hours of it when it kind of hit that crazy moment.
We've seen a couple on RevenueCat site, a couple viral events like that, and I am blown away every single time. It's more like it outpaces the App Store featuring like by 10 or 100x. It's insane.
And I think that, and obviously that was really cool and fun and like exciting and a little bit like scary and like terrifying. But I think I didn't know where it would settle down to, and it's like, where is that? 'Cause obviously the nature of something being a flavor of the moment is that like that moment ends and it just vanishes. Like the driver behind that, it's not like it's being featured in TikTok videos anymore, and at least not in the same way. And so the durability, I believe now, is largely just coming from the fact that that initial spike generates enough kind of ongoing word of mouth advertising that especially the nature of what it does is it puts something cool on your home screen, and it has that natural, if someone sees your home screen or you show them something or you share a screenshot, it has the name of the app in it, and it's like it has that natural, oh, I want to do that too-ness to it. And that seems to be where the durability has come from, because I've tried sort of like the paid marketing things to try and keep something going, and for me, it's a model that it's very hard to not just like lose your shirt on, because you can so easily outspend what you're getting back, or not.
So if you have somebody else's money to blow,
yeah. And so like for me, it's just it never makes sense. And so like I want, if something's going to be something that I keep working on, it needs to be sustainable kind of on its own. And for it still continues to do really well on a download basis, and is also it is monetized both with advertising and with subscriptions. And so the two together create a really nice sustainable revenue for me, that it's based mostly on usage rather than needing necessarily to have big spikes in downloads to keep it going. It's like, as long as people keep using the app, if they're opening it, they'll see ads, or if they're power users and who really want like the pro features of it, and they pay for a subscription, if it's continuing to provide value to them, that they'll continue subscribing. And so it's that durability has been there, I think, largely. It certainly is easy to be durable when you have this wild spike at the beginning to kind of kickstart that effort. But it seems like there's enough ongoing utility of it that people keep using it, and that has a natural sort of knock-on effect of people just telling their friends about it. And I mean, it's kind of a cool thing that even after many millions of downloads, it continues to find a new market, and people continue to sign up for the subscription, and that's happening sort of on its own without me having to necessarily do anything other than just keep adding features and improvements to it. I don't need to worry necessarily on that side of things as much.
yeah, one of the things that I was initially taken aback by, but now see the maybe accidental brilliance of how permissive you were with the feature. So, and I made a mistake with Launch Center Pro. I was actually trying to kind of ride your coattails with my app, and was much more aggressive with the paywall. So I paywalled one of the like more prominent features instead of paywalling some of the lesser features. And then to your point earlier about like user acquisition, part of how you make user acquisition work is that you can't pay $5 for a download if 1 out of 200 people are paying you. But Widgetsmith going viral, it went viral in part because you were so permissive with the features. So like, how did you decide where to draw the line in the paywall? Yeah, how did you make those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes from a place of, my goal is I want a business that lets me keep developing. Like, what I love and what I enjoy is programming. That's I'm gifted in it. I enjoy it. I love it, and I will just keep doing it. Like, if it wasn't my job, I'd probably still be making apps. And so I'm not chasing some kind of like wild exit or something dramatic. And so I think I feel like I want to make things that people will like using and that won't be annoying or irritating, and that I can feel proud of at the end of the day. Like that I'm not, like the people who are paying for my subscription are paying it out of a genuine desire to support the app, to do the really advanced, like these are my super fans who really care about it. And they're the people who I'm sort of going after for that. And so I didn't feel necessarily compelled to make the paywall up all in your face and be limiting features and kind of doing those types of things. And in this case, it worked out really well because it created it created its own marketing machine as a result. And like what I gave up potentially in having a less permissive market paywall strategy, I made up for in essentially free marketing because the app is used by so many more people. And I think that trade-off is something that's easy. It's like I don't necessarily want to spend the capital to acquire those people, but in some ways I'm spending that capital by just making my paywall more permissive and making it have a natural more virality to it. And that for me, I think works well for everybody, that like more people are getting more out of the app, and I benefit from it sort of coming along. And I don't think it's not like this grand strategy that I had for it. It was just in general, if someone's going to pay me something, I want for what they're paying to be something that is super clear, is super straightforward, and is compelling. That is something that I feel like I would pay for, that it isn't an arbitrary restriction or something that feels kind of mean-spirited. That sometimes a lot of paywalls you can run into these limitations that feel completely contrived, that there isn't a reason for it. Like most of what people paying me for in Widgetsmith are things like my weather data, the tide data, and some graphical assets, things that I have to pay for, that they are ongoing and tangible costs that I have to pay. So I can't make those free because then I go out of business because millions of people are requesting weather data. Like that doesn't work for me. And so making it paid feels good to me, and I think it works well. But I think that's definitely something that you can get. If you're too stingy with what you offer, you're kind of like shooting yourself in the foot, because you want to make that first run experience feel so good that people want to keep coming back. And if you get too uptight, that the first thing the app does when you open the app is ask for money. Like if I open that app, I'm just closing that app and deleting it. Like I don't want that my first experience to be them asking.
That's an app that's paying for distribution, basically, is what you can tell. And if you're not, then like, I mean, I think this is not an uncommon strategy, but optimizing for distribution early, becoming not a monopoly because there's other apps like Widgetsmith, but becoming a dominant player or like the best app. You get data, you get usage, you get word of mouth, you get a brand. And then in the future, if it becomes an operational requirement that you make more money per download or whatever, like, you have a lot of levers there and you can go about it more thoughtfully than if you try to shoot blindfolded, like from the start. There's just no way you're going to be able to get. And I talked to a lot of people getting ready to make their subscription apps and whatever, and they're like, they're going back and forth, like, oh, what should I put on my paywall? What should I, whatever? I'm just like, just don't think about it too much. Just don't do something stupid. Like, just do something reasonable and normal, and don't try to be too clever. And then, be prepared to iterate and change like over time, because you inevitably will.
That's good advice.
This is such a fascinating topic. I wish we could talk another hour just on paywall strategies and freemium. I think a lot of developers do make the mistake in the subscription space of, because they're spending so much on user acquisition, they have to be more aggressive with the paywall. But then in the long run, you're paying for users that you immediately ostracize. If you're only getting 10% to start your free trial, and then only 50% of those convert, it's like you're paying for all these people who ultimately have a bad experience in your app. And so it works because that's their model, but they're leaving a lot on the table long run by not having a more permissive freemium strategy where you can get people in using the app, finding value, and then over time bringing them along. And it seems like that's part of what Widgetsmith has done well with. Like, you didn't start with ads. Ads came later, right? And then the paying for assets, I think, came later as well. So like, exactly to Jacob's point, it's like you just got out there with a great product, found that product market fit. It went viral. I mean, it probably wouldn't be the success it is today without that. But then you've kind of layered on some additional money making over time. And so that's great. But anyhow, we're at the top of the hour and need to wrap up. in the show notes, we'll have links to your Twitter _Smith_David Smith.
Oh my God, I never realized the pun. Widgetsmith, Dave. Oh my God, I'm so slow. It's amazing.
Yeah.
The brand is just so it's perfect. Fell right in your lap. It's so great.
Yeah. No, that was as soon as it was one of those names where once the name came to me, it's like, yep, that's the name.
Oh, it's a good name on its own, right? And then I just love when things are like tidy and tied up like that. It's so perfect. Sorry.
Anyways, I was just gonna say anything else you wanted to share, or anything else you want to mention as we wrap up?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we covered some good things, and I think it is. I always like sharing my story as an independent developer, because I feel like in this industry, there's an aspect of it. I know this is something, having listened to this Subclub podcast before. Like there's an industry and a branch of this space that is very data oriented, and like you're built. It's almost like you're building a machine to try, like a business machine to try and like spin off money, and it's all about how you're getting your conversion value to this, and then you can put it into this, and there's a very like, and I respect that, and I understand that is a very like viable business. But I think what I always like sort of to share the other side of this story, where it's also possible to just make cool things and have enough of a business in them that it makes a good living for you, but you don't need all of that infrastructure and all of that other things. And I think, to our point we've made many times, is if you have something that you take the approach of simplicity and straightforwardness and craftsmanship early, you can shift and pivot and change as you go. And if you start too numbers driven and you start too like kind of cold in that way, I think you can lose just as many opportunities as you could. And I enjoy this way. I think this is fun. I'm very excited about WWDC next week, because it's the time that I get to just discover what I'm going to launch this year, kind of thing. Right. And so I'm very excited about that. And I think that excitement is something that I wouldn't have if I was building something that I didn't enjoy doing in quite the same way.
Yeah, that's so great. Well, thanks, David, so much for your time, and
good luck next week.
Thanks.
To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.